This is Conspirinormal.
Alright guys, welcome to Conspirinormal. It's your friendly host, Adam, and Serfiel is on the line. Hello. And guys, we've got someone that I think needs no introduction, but we've got David Metcalfe on the line. David, welcome back to Conspirinormal, man.
Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, it's good to have you back. Last time we had you on was last May, I think. So It's over a year, and I had the privilege of hanging out with you in Georgia last year when we did the Paramania thing. I was up there with Josh Cutchin and Tim Banal and all those guys. And now we got you on for the second time. And actually, we kind of figured it out, like the episode we had you on, that was Rob's last show, Serfiel, with us.
Oh, wow.
Well, last, I guess a show as a producer.
He's still living. He's just not on the show.
Yeah. And we have to make that distinction. It's like, sometimes we'll say, like, Rob is no longer with us. No, he's not dead. He's very much alive. He just, he's just not doing the podcast anymore. So, I just kind of have just a general kind of grab bag of topics, David. We kind of looked at some of your, well, Serfiel can tell you what he got some of your articles and such, and we'll just kind of go through some of that stuff. But I got some other questions too, and some other topics that we can talk about. But
yeah, great.
Where did you get those, Serfiel? Those
were just on his academia.edu page.
Yeah.
Oh, you went for the fancy stuff.
The fancy stuff, yeah. Mm-hmm. Like the Craigslist conjurations and all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Well,
because you've been kind of we talked a little earlier about how I guess you're in a new area of Georgia still though now, and you've kind of become like a anthropologist of kind of like this rural magic and traditions and popular magic traditions too. Things that might be at a Walmart, or you call them these dollar store grimoires, right?
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
And so a lot of this kind of revolves around that, and your how your journey into studying this kind of stuff has come from. Really, you would say that it comes from your move to the South. A lot of it.
Well, in part, yes. My move to the South was fortuitous in allowing me better access, I think, to a lot of it. The specific, especially the lottery dream book stuff.
Yeah.
Which are it's a book you can get at the gas station, at least down here. You can also get them in Detroit. I met some ladies from Detroit who were quite fond of them. It's a book that has some information on numerology, some information on kind of thinking about your dreams in a psychic way, and then most of the books are just lists of words that you might have in your dream, like a ring, car, like whatever, and then it has a number associated with it that you can play on the lottery. And so these things have been around since the late 1800s when they were policy books. So policy is an old form of the lottery that was prior to the kind of official state lottery stuff, and they've been adapted now to be able to be used with your regular lottery numbers and that. So that came from a southern thing, but it's kind of weird. My family is on my dad's side's from Kentucky, right? So I always kind of had this a little bit of kind of like southern influence floating in, and some of that like folklore in that. And so I've always been really interested in the kind of like passed down knowledge, different kind of like superstitions and that kind of thing. And then in college I actually did study witchcraft traditions and comparative religions and ritual, so along with cognitive philosophy, so kind of bridging how we construct reality, and then also kind of the ritual components of that, and then how different traditions have looked at magic or psychic influences in that. So it's always kind of been there. But since I've moved to the South, I've been able to live in rural areas and get to know people and get to actually have conversations with folks that had, whether it was their father or their great-great-grandfather or great-great-uncle who actually were practitioners of various forms of folk magic. And so it's really deepened my, what was kind of like you read that in a book, or you kind of, you see it in like a folklore documentation and that versus actually being here where I can talk to people who are like, oh yeah, my great-great-uncle used to do healing or, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so it's just really, really prevalent in the area that you live in, much
Yeah.
more so than it would be in some kind of urban center.
Yeah, and that's kind of the thing. So I learned the techniques for discovering this stuff up in Chicago, right? Like I was living in the western suburbs of Chicago, and I would go downtown. And one of the things that fascinated me is that you can look at the architecture and see theosophical influences. Where I spent my teenage years was a town over from the Theosophical Society and also the Billy Graham Center at Wheaton College. So two of my areas, the grocery store Grimoires and that come from the Billy Graham side, and then the Theosophical Society is kind of the magic side. But
Yet,
they were
yet both sorceers.
Yeah, exactly.
If you really think about it.
Yeah, the two ends of sorcery. So that was really prevalent in my teenage years, those kind of influences and being able to go over there and kind of see the stuff. But I'd go down to Chicago, and Frank Lloyd Wright was really interested in theosophy, and a lot of his designs were based on theosophical principles.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, I think he actually married one of Rorik's secretaries, I believe, or Gurdjieff.
Wow.
It was either Gurdjieff or Rorik, but he was married, or there was some relationship there. I don't know the details enough to be exact on that. But so he had a lot of influence from those traditions in his stuff. So you'd go down in Oak Park, and there were, the Frank Lloyd Wright buildings, and knowing that kind of background to it made it a lot more interesting. And then when I was in downtown proper, you would see different Pythagorean things on the buildings, and you would see these influences from the kind of Neo-Egyptian period that happened around the times of the World's Fair at the late 1800s and early 1900s. And when, Chicago was an occult publishing center where you had people like William Walker Atkinson and L.W. de Lawrence publishing books that would influence kind of the culture throughout the United States, that led into New Thought and that led into even like salesmanship kind of books and stuff like that. And so it was just really fascinating to me to see these kind of remnants in the architecture in that. And I became absolutely obsessed with William Walker Atkinson and de Lawrence. And one of the things that de Lawrence did, L.W. de Lawrence was a publisher who started out publishing hypnotism and kind of like positive thinking sort of stuff, but then also found that it was very it was very profitable to be able to break international copyright, and started publishing Golden Dawn material, and some of the folks that were associated with Golden Dawn, like A.E. Waite and Frater Akkad, publishing those guys in the U.S., sometimes stripping their name off of it and putting his own on and his own intro, and he would just publish their book under the de Lawrence imprint. He also sold candles, magic rings, talismans. He had this massive, like literally a phone book sized catalog that he shipped throughout the Caribbean, throughout the South, and even into West Africa. And so he had this massive influence in the throughout the 20th century in terms of sculpting people's ideas of magic. And he had a book called it's the Great Book of Hindu Magical Art or something like that, which is, again, a telephone-sized book where he just crammed a bunch of different, a lot of it plagiarized, some of it plagiarized from Kardec, some of it plagiarized from Barrett and Barrett's The Magus, some of it plagiarized from A.E. Waite, some of it he wrote himself, and it was just this hodgepodge of all these different influences crammed into this book. so he was able to kind of influence all these different things with this sort of pirate mentality of publishing. But to go down to the South and to see these things actually sort of still living, that were obviously influenced by his work, was pretty amazing. So there's been a continuation, from Chicago down to the South.
Well, and just because it's the Bible Belt doesn't mean that all of these occult movements did not have any influence. And it sounds like in some instances they have more of a continuing influence than in other places.
Oh, absolutely. Well, you have, with the grocery store grimoire thing, it's a kind of joking name that I put on it because when you see in news reports of exorcism and that, it's always focused on Catholicism. And, they're always talking about Catholic exorcism. But my brother used to work for Pat Robertson in the 700 Club, and he was a pastor up in Virginia, and he did what was called theophostic counseling and deliverance ministry, which is a form of exorcism. And so, I knew that this wasn't just a Catholic thing, and that it had a little bit more spread than that, But when I was at Walmart one day, and I noticed that they actually had books on spiritual warfare and exorcism, which were, it was occultism, right? And it was lists of names of demons, how to deal with those demons, how to see those demons or recognize them, and that's a grimoire. That's what a grimoire is, And the grimoire tradition, comes out of the early exorcist traditions. These were books of conjuration and exorcism. Exorcism actually has a similar etymology to conjuration, because you conjure the spirit into the person and then expel them. So it was amazing to me to see these books, which were just flying under the radar, that you could pick up in Walmart. And I found out you could pick them up in the grocery store, and no one would look twice at them because they were these Christian books. But they were essentially, they were books on the on conjuration and evocation and exorcism. So that became really interesting to me to see these contemporary versions of grimoires in a still living tradition, that were just flying under the radar, that weren't being looked at really as what they were, which were books of magic.
Which particular ones kind of stood out to you the most? Kind of more interested you?
Well, they actually have, some of them have designs that are very similar to a grimoire, like Prayers That Rout Demons, which is by John Eckhart. Was actually designed to look like a leather-bound book with a metal clasp on it and jewels on the front of it. And John Eckhart's a charismatic pastor from up in the Chicago area. But also interesting to me was that in a lot of the cases with the spiritual warfare stuff, you saw the same transmission lines that you were seeing with DeLawrence, where DeLawrence was publishing in Chicago, it was being shipped to West Africa. Well, in the spiritual warfare tradition, a lot of the West African traditions that were influenced by DeLawrence were then feeding back to the Pentecostal and charismatic groups in the United States through missionary work and through kind of, transatlantic conversation that was going on between charismatic groups in Africa and then charismatic groups in the United States. So you saw this really interesting kind of like cross communication going on, and this over time, this pretty detailed conversation on these traditions, all of which centered around spirit summoning, working with spirits, whether it was the quote unquote magician working with them in one way versus the exorcist who was working to get rid of them,
I have noticed in my own kind of studies of a lot of this, and I've kind of come from a different viewpoint, and now I'm kind of just getting to the point where I'm seeing that a lot of this is folk magic, and I came from the viewpoint of looking at this like as a Christian and seeing some of these occult influences as something negative. That's kind of how I started. Now I kind of think differently about it and just realize that there's an overlap But I have noticed that too. And there seems to have been like with something, a good example I think was like the blood moons when that was going on, right? And I would have
the John Hagee book with that cover. Yeah, that's.
I would have conversations with Dr. Future about this, and we would talk about how, apparently it's astrology and numerology are bad for these people, unless it has that kind of Judeo-Christian kind of overtone to it, then it's okay. But essentially, with like the blood moons, that's what you're dealing with, is like astrology and numerology. It's essentially the same thing.
Right, absolutely. Well, and that's, I've had similar conversations with folks who knew the evangelical guy Chuck Missler. And I had pointed out that Chuck Missler had used Kabbalah, and they were like, no. He looked at Kabbalah, and I was like, he was doing straight up Kabbalah. Like, come on, like, let's be honest. Like, he's doing Kabbalah. Yeah. Like, this is what Kabbalah is. Yeah. Like, if you're not being prejudiced against Kabbalah, like, and you look at what Chuck Missler's doing, he's doing Kabbalah. And there's, and that's what's interesting to me, because then Chuck Missler gets into stuff that, it bleeds into the Collins elite kind of stuff, right? Because Missler was a defense contractor, and he worked in the defense industry. And then, you've got Redfern's kind of mythology of the Collins elite. And so, all this stuff kind of blends in together, and a lot of the details of it sort of get lost in the soup there. But it's really fascinating. I mean, and Tom Horn's work, right?
I mean, absolutely.
That stuff. What did Dr. Future call it? The grindhouse of evangelism or something.
Yeah. It really is, and it's interesting, David, because really, honestly, Tom Horn for a good while was kind of like a big influence on me, right? Because he really, like, L.A. Marzulli was too, on some of my thoughts on like the whole aliens or demons stuff. But Tom Horn was the first one that I ever heard on, because I had just become a Christian at that point, probably a few years before, and I was just kind of like just finding my legs with it. And all of a sudden, I had the subscription to Coast at the time, and Tom Horn was on, and he's talking to George Norrie. And like everything he was saying about the demons and aliens are demons and the alien abductions are all part of our demonic thing, and I guess some stuff about Jack Parsons was in there, and all that kind of interesting stuff. And it's like I was sitting there like I was like 27. I was just like, this is right on. This is it. I found my answer. And since then, I've kind of realized all that stuff is kind of, it's a lot more complicated than that. But it's giving that simplistic answer. But also, Tom Horn is very much, I mean, he weaves in all this kind of conspiracy narrative, and he weaves in all this demonic kind of stuff, and he makes all these predictions about Apollyon and 2012, and then that didn't happen, and then it went over to 2016, and then he really hopped on the popes, like the last pope.
The Exo Vaticana stuff.
Right, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, that he did with Chris Putnam, rest in peace. And Horn, I actually got to meet Tom Horn at one point because Mike spoke at the Future Congress or whatever it was called.
Right. Well, and Mike's in the Pandemonium's Engine.
Yep.
With a great piece on Nimrod as a Nephilim super soldier.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And all the Nephilim stuff is mixed in there, and just like funny stuff, man. I just like I'm kind of reminiscing on some of this, but like at the first Future Congress, I didn't go to the second. I drove with this guy I barely knew and his daughter, cool dude, and we ended up going to Branson. Okay, and Branson is like the holy land for these people now, which is interesting in and of itself. Right. When you think about like Sergio, wasn't like the holy, like the Garden of Eden for the Mormons in Missouri or something like that? Well, or it was Illinois, or it was somewhere. Well,
there's a few contenders for Zion in America, but it's also it's the rival country music capital as well. So
that's right.
right. Yeah. So I drove from Nashville to Branson, which is like which is like some kind of mystical journey.
Yeah, I was going to say
but when I got there and I signed in, like they were giving numbers to people, and like my number was 666.
Wow. Yeah. Did you get like pulled out of line and they were like,
I looked at him. I said, "Hey, that's not good. Just make me 667 or something."
Wow.
You were the chosen one. You came as the Nephilim chosen one.
Well, a lot of this openness to the supernatural really is a characteristic that you talk about. It's really characteristic of this new Apostolic Reformation movement. For people who don't know what that is, can you kind of give a brief background on it?
Yeah, so Tom Horn actually, I was surprised, but Tom Horn critiques the New Apostolic Reformation. He at times has said that he's not it's called dominionism. Dominionism is the idea that they will bring about God's kingdom on earth through conquering what are known as the 7 mountains. And the 7 mountains are like education, government, arts, basically all the things that make up society, right? So, and they've broken it down into a convenient 7 mountain formation. You conquer those mountains, you're at the highest point, and you rule that. And basically what that means is that you infiltrate culture at every area where there's a leverage to influence it, and you get your people in there, and then you push an agenda. And so the New Apostolic Reformation is sometimes it's called third wave charismatic or third wave Pentecostalism, and it's supposedly this third outpouring of the Spirit in which there's a new era of prophets and apostles who are going to come in to usher in the kingdom, right, and conquer those mountains. And so this idea was formulated by a couple different people, but one of the main theorists behind the New Apostolic Reformation in that terminology is a guy called C. Peter Wagner, who worked in missions studies at Fuller Theological Seminary. And he, what's amazing to me about Wagner's work is that he took, he eventually was based out of Colorado Springs, Colorado, which is where the space program is based out of.
Yeah, that's another Holy Land too. Colorado Springs.
Yeah, and so it was this amazing mix of like with Wagner, he took information operations like military strategy and psyops, and he took kind of a very militarized and then also kind of like a corporate leadership aspect, and he took all of these things which you find in kind of like the like the officer class of the military, and he combined it with third wave Pentecostal concepts or third wave charismatic concepts, and was able to basically weaponize Christianity. And so he created these ideas of, and I mean, in their terminology and the way they think about it, like they have Wagner coined a term called strategic spiritual warfare. And so what you do is you go in and you run demographics on an area, and you figure out who in his terminology, you figure out who are the major gods there, right? But in Los Angeles, it would be, you go there and you basically do demographics like, okay, you have this many Latinos, you have this, this in the black community and that, and then what are the different religions?
The powers and principalities.
Exactly, yeah, you're figuring out. And so he took these biblical terms and turned them into weaponized, social engineering concepts. And then instead of, going one way or the other with it, he was able to kind of hold these things both, where it's both social engineering and it's also has a spiritual religious component to it, and use the weight of that to kind of create this this weaponized form of Christianity, which he was doing that in around like 79 and into the 80s. And it's exploded, and it's infiltrated almost every denomination of Christianity to some extent.
You go in, you find out the power that is over the prince of the air, that is over the city, and you challenge them directly,
right?
And you wage this spiritual warfare against them,
right? And
it's a lot like counterinsurgency operations.
It's exactly like that, and that's what's amazing about it. I mean, he's literally weaponized Christianity. It's absolutely it's astonishing to me, and it's scary in a lot of ways. I mean, in Brazil, on my blog, I have an article called "Third Wave Power Encounter in Brazil," and I mean, they're killing people, right? Like, it leads to lynchings. It leads to violence against indigenous people. It leads to violence against minority groups, and it's really frightening to see what would seem goofy on paper enacted in a way that literally leads to war on minority groups and on indigenous groups, and groups that are outside the veil of the Christian norm as these people see it. It's pretty...
Well, because with that warfare terminology, you're essentially calling other beliefs, people with other beliefs, enemies. They're like...
Right.
Yeah. Well, they say that the people aren't enemies, but the powers that are over the people are enemies. But what's the fine line there? I mean, you can easily cross that line.
Yeah, and that's when it becomes this... depending on where it falls, it can just be like a nice group of folks praying to have the land healed or whatever, or it can be like a violent encounter with Brazilian, paramilitarized police or something.
I have the evangelical movement is very huge in Brazil, and in fact now Bolsonaro he's an evangelical, right. And the evangelicals in Brazil absolutely adore him and love him, similar to the way that they do Trump here in the United States. But it's interesting because I've actually been to Brazil, and I've actually been to one of the services, and here's this guy, like, looks like, he's got the whole like evangelist hairdo, you know what I mean? The Oral Roberts kind of stuff going on, and he's up there just yelling in Portuguese, and like, I could understand a little bit of Portuguese because I'd been exposed to it for a while, but like, all of a sudden, like, this woman just starts shaking, and he's performing an exorcism like right in front of me, and I'm like having this moment of like, where am I right now? But it's there's also Dr. Future Mike. He also talked about on Future Quake. I remember him talking about one of these guys that were Dominionists, and how this it was a woman, I can't remember her name, but she went to Mount Everest. She had this whole story where she said she went to Mount Everest, and she tackled some demon up on the hilltop and all this kind of stuff on the mountain. And I was going to ask you too, David, and I kind of wanted to get you to explain some terms here in a second, but I was going to ask you too about at the end, towards the end of last year, we had a lady on that actually lives here in Nashville that was involved with this group growing up that she terms a cult called King's Chapel. And they were outside, they were based in Connecticut. And if you ever get a chance to listen to her podcast, which is called Cult in Connecticut, where she basically interviews these people that have left it, it's very much seems like it is one of these new Apostolic Reformation churches. Because one of the things that they would do is they would go to these different places and they would cast out the demons in the places. Like, for instance, the one time they went to Alaska, and like they would pretty much make the congregation essentially give them all their money so they could go to Alaska, but they had to stay in the best hotels, eat the best food because they were doing such intense spiritual warfare.
Right.
And all this kind of stuff. I don't know if you've ever heard of that group, but
I haven't. There's a King's Chapel that was out in Georgia, close to where I'm at, but I don't think it's the same thing. They had their own kind of weirdness. They had their own kind of weirdness going on. I don't think it's the same group though. It was a tape ministry that literally the pastor had died, and they just had a ton of tapes, and so they would all sit in this abandoned. I mean, it wasn't abandoned, but the church was essentially abandoned. There was really no church anymore. And it was just some folks that would sit at tables and listen to these tapes on repeat. Wow. It was very weird. It had a spooky kind of air to it. But yeah, so I don't think it's the same thing. But yeah, that sounds very much the kind of tenor of the New Apostolic Reformation idea. And one of the things with this stuff too is that they use a decentralized methodology, and that's so, kind of getting into the like nitty gritty of these books being at the grocery store. In conquering the media and conquering that mountain, one of the things you want to do is you want to get your ideas spread out as far as possible. And so the fact that you can go to, I found a C. Peter Wagner book on strategic spiritual warfare at a truck stop in one of the Carolinas. So, here's a trucker that's, or someone driving through the Carolinas, and they stop off and you look at the book rack and here's a book on strategic spiritual warfare. And this was a book that compiled talks that were given at a conference, right? So this wasn't like just some like popular, here's some ideas on spiritual warfare kind of book, which in and of itself is kind of weird, but this was literally conference papers given at one of their conferences on spiritual warfare and missions. So that spread where it kind of, you get that, your pastor gets that book and reads it and starts to implement these ideas, and then you have the different layers of organization in a decentralized organization where you have the outer layer, which is the media. Well, I guess the true outer layer would be the ideas kind of being fostered in popular culture. Then the next is the media that's fostering those ideas. The next is those authors. Anyone in authority at a church or in a prayer group or whatever who wants to contact those leaders can then contact the leader. And if they have some kind of worth to the organization, those people can then be drawn deeper into the inner circles, And so eventually you're going to Colorado Springs to a leadership conference to learn, how to lead your congregation into victory against the devil.
Kind of like a cell-based system, kind of like how Al Qaeda radicalized people. It's exactly, and I mean they've been called the American Al Qaeda. They've been, not the American Al Qaeda, although you're right.
Taliban.
The American Taliban has been the name for it because they believe in what's essentially Christian Sharia law, right? So it's and it's really interesting to see. I mean, it's basically a terrorist organization. They want to take over the world. Dominion for their concept of God, and I think the ambiguity for me is that I don't know where the level of just like corruption is, as studying in kind of a trying to study it in an academic or scholarly way, you always kind of want to give the benefit of the doubt and just kind of look at it objectively. But recently, I've just started to kind of get to the point where I'm like, yeah, this is kind of bad. Like this,
Yeah.
like the influence that I'm seeing come out of this thing, like, isn't really positive. Like this is, it's gone beyond my ability to be objective with this, and it's actually kind of dangerous for culture, especially when it gets into, violating people's rights and actually attacking, groups that are don't mean anything.
Well, these
They're not
guys, they really want to set up a theocracy. I mean, that's kind of the main point of them. And when you mention that Tom Horn and his group were against them, that was true. I mean, when I would listen to that little crowd a lot, that was, I think, they did talk a lot about the new Apostolic Reformation and how that was dominionism and stuff was not a good idea. But I don't know now. I mean, things have changed. Things have changed so much that I have to wonder if they're not because like they're really in bed with Jim Baker.
Yeah.
And Baker makes a lot of comments about. I mean, it's really not like the whole thing about Trump being Cyrus, King David, the imperfect man that will save Christianity, this type of thing. There's not really much of a difference between that and what the new Apostolic Reformation and the Dominionists preach, in my opinion. No. I mean, it's not, you're really, even if you're two different camps, the end result that you want is still the same.
Well, in their naked ambitions that they admit to in conquering this mountain of government, I mean, they behave like a classic nefarious secret society. It's like something we've definitely explored this stuff with Dr. Future, but this idea of like just filling the government and big business as much as they can with their people. So I guess when the time comes or whatever, it's pretty scary, and everything that people fear about secret societies, I mean, this is like right there.
And there's other groups such as the Family, which is another one that has a whole other set of beliefs, but still is very much, courting men in power.
Well, and that's the interesting thing, though, is that, when you have these decentralized organizations, each named group can have a different belief. But, like Seraphiel said, is if you have the same kind of goals, right? Like different groups work to the same goal. And at the end, the goal is achieved. And it doesn't really matter, that one was called the Family and one was the New Apostolic Reformation. They all kind of like layer into each other because they're all decentralized. And it's kind of, I mean, at a certain, at the beginning of my studies of this stuff, it was kind of like a cultural study. And now it's almost become like oh wow, like this is kind of disturbing. Like a study of a terrorist organization, really,
Political implications are.
Yeah. Well, then, I mean, and we see it. There was a letter that was written by a Catholic traditionalist to, from a position of some authority within the Vatican structure, not like from the Vatican, but within that, like some of it's a complicated kind of multi-tentacled organization. So, but he's within some of the more authoritative voices surrounding the Vatican, and he wrote a letter that literally had the same keywords as stuff that Skywatch TV and Tom Horn and that were putting out in the same like couple of days, and then they sourced another article that was on the place that this guy from the Vatican, this archbishop, had published his letter. They sourced in one of their articles the same website, not the same letter that he wrote, but it was on the same website. And then 2 days later, they sourced his letter. And these guys are supposed to be charismatic, anti-palpal, all that kind of stuff. But they're obviously feeding from the same trough of information. Right. They're using the same keywords. They're using the same ideas. And when you start to look at and this is what was fascinating to me and now kind of terrifying about Wagner, is that he turned all this stuff that was, spiritual warfare and he really had a nuanced understanding of what, because, when you get into one of the weird things with when you look at these groups is that they know Greek, they know Latin, right? Like with the most educated amongst these folks know the translations. And so when they read the Bible, they're not reading the English translation, they're going back and saying, what did that word mean? What did this word mean? And so when they read demon, they know that it goes back to the Greek word daemon, and they know the daemon, and they know the difference between psyche and the different words for soul that are used, pneuma, right? Like pneuma and psyche are two words that are translated in English as soul, but they mean two different things. Mm-hmm. And so, with the Chuck Missler being into Kabbalah and that, like, they go and they actually look at the original roots of these words, and they've been able to extract some kind of functional dynamic from that. And so the ability to use ideas and words and understand when they say demon, most people are thinking like and they, a lot of them will write about it. Like you were describing that woman, like going up on a mountain and they fight a demon and there's this kind of visionary experience that they have. Right. But the weaponized version of it is that they understand that demon also means mindset. And they know that the ability to manipulate ideas and to manipulate ideas through words is something that can be developed and triggered in people, and it becomes information warfare, and so when you see an archbishop from the Vatican circle publishing a letter that has the same keywords that the Skywatch folks and Tom Horn and that are publishing, the question becomes what exactly are we seeing here? Because this looks an awful lot like an information operation more than it looks like something spiritual.
Well, let me ask you this, because it's interesting that you brought this up. You bring up in this article, and this is something that I've thought of before. You bring up The Conjuring. Mm-hmm. And
right.
You just kind of talked about kind of like this kind of more charismatic kind of Catholic group that has kind of the same goals, but you bring this movie up, and I have felt, and I think I mentioned this on the last episode, but I have felt like watching some of these movies since The Conjuring came out, that whole kind of Conjuring universe with the Annabelle and all that kind of stuff. I've kind of felt like a lot of that, I feel like it's like kind of a pro-traditionalist Catholic propaganda.
Absolutely. Well, and it's openly that. And that's the interesting thing. Like these, it's one of the most popular, I don't know, I can't say the most popular, but it is one of the most popular horror franchises. And, in terms of sales and people seeing it and that. And it was completely Catholic propaganda, like openly. They were proud of that. Like that was the goal to, what they were doing was to kind of create Catholic propaganda. And the Warrens themselves were part of this weird sort of subculture of, I don't know if you're familiar with Malachi Martin and that, but they're not Orthodox, but they still are kind of like soldiers for in Catholicism, there's a thing called the Church Militant and the Church Victorious. So the Church Victorious is sort of the contemplative acceptance of God's dominion over the world anyway, and it doesn't really matter who's in charge in the physical plane. The Church Militant are the folks that go out to claim God's kingdom. And so the Warrens were part of this kind of strange underground of Church Militant folk who were not really Orthodox in the way that most people would think, but were kind of given the ability to go out and work within the kind of demonic realm to spread a semi-Orthodox message. It's hard to describe exactly the kind of differentiation there.
Well,
it seems like it's related to the idea of crusade, and that they're really appealing to people and to that idea of crusade,
Yes.
and in embracing the supernatural. Also, it seems like it has appeal for both Catholics and Protestants, because many
Right.
people don't resonate with that sterile modern Christianity. They're putting something back into it for people, and then if you have that crusade element too, it seems like a way of reinvigorating it.
And you're right, because that's what resonated for me, was like really when I kind of first started, was just like, very much like there is a literal battle between good and evil, and I still kind of think that way in many ways, but it's like, there's a literal battle between good and evil, and what side do you want to be on? We're in a war. It's very much that kind of militant kind of Christianity, but in the Catholic realm. But one thing that I was going to say about this is that, David, you would be surprised, I think, just from, and it may be changing now, but, back in earlier part of this decade, when I was going to a lot of these conferences, a lot of these paranormal conferences, a lot of the stuff a lot of that worldview, that very traditionalist Catholic, good versus evil, angels versus demons, that kind of worldview was very much a part of the popular paranormal scene.
Oh, absolutely.
Because had guys like, you had the Warrens, but you had John Zaffis out there, doing his thing, and just a lot of that was very, very dominant.
Yeah, that was I forget the name of the guy. I actually went to a conference with George Hansen and Shannon Taggart up in New Jersey, and they had a guy who had studied with a friend of the Warrens, or he was a friend of the Warrens, and he brought that in, and it was essentially an occult conference. It wasn't even a paranormal conference, like it was practicing occultists. And this guy came to talk about conjuration and exorcism, and that was even within the occulture, it was kind of bleeding in, and that's when you have something like the Vatican, which is a close to 2,000-year-old organization, they know how to get their message out, and they know how to do it in ways that, and it's strange because it sounds like it's bleeding into conspiracy, but it's not conspiracy so much as just how information flows and how you get cultures to change and how you get minds to change. Tim LaHaye has a book called Battle for the Mind, which ironically is named after, not named after, but it has the same or similar name to a book that was written by William Sargent, who was one of the guys from MKUltra. He did studies in post-traumatic stress and what was called shell shock at the time. And then he went and studied voodoo techniques for inducing possession. He also has a book on possession and that. But he was one of the people that did shock therapy and, Thorazine treatment and that to kind of basically break people's minds and kind of get into that. But so there's, all these things kind of blend in together. I'm not really into the conspiracy concept of it, because to me it's the way the world works. It's the way the information works. It's the way people's minds work. And if you want to control the culture, you want to influence the culture, you think your message is the way the culture should run, eventually you're going to stumble on stuff that's the way you've got to do it.
And they're open about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they have books on it, and that was the one of the articles I wrote, an academic piece called "Satan's Target Your Mind," which was about spiritual warfare and the New Apostolic Reformation and the idea of the grocery store grimoire and that, and it was kind of along that lines of the good versus evil, but it's like, who's evil? Who truly is serving this kind of concept of a world dominating power? Is it the folks who are doing folk magic to heal people, and this folks that are kind of like Voden, where it's community practice where it brings everybody together, or is it these people who are literally trying to conquer the world with manipulative kind of information warfare techniques.
Are the ones that have already conquered the world and are trying to hold on to it.
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
I want to make something clear though too, that like I'm not dogging Catholicism, but I find it interesting that when you're just watching a simple movie, a film, these ideas can still just seep in, and a lot of people just aren't aware.
Yeah,
that what is happening is like you have this subtle propaganda.
Yeah, well, and that's
there's an ideology to it.
Yeah, and a worldview too. I mean, it's literally shaping the way that you view phenomena. And that was one of the things that really connected me to Diana Pasulka's work, was that was why she went and consulted on the Conjuring movies, was she wanted
that's
to
right
see,
she did. I forgot about that.
yeah, and she wanted to see, as a scholar, how do these media techniques alter people's memories, and how do they alter people's worldviews, and how do they alter the way that people literally live their lives and encounter this stuff? Because I've studied parapsychology for quite a while, and so to me the phenomena is real to whatever extent that's true, right? Like there is something out there. There are these things that people can do, whether it's precognition or psychokinesis and that, and then how does the media shape our interpretation of those events? Mm-hmm. And so, even the Exorcist movie, the actual case that movie and that book is based on, originally the Lutheran pastors who dealt with the child who was, supposedly possessed, they went to the Rhine Center, and they were like, we think that we have a PK. We think that we have a psychokinetic kind of poltergeist experience going on here. Right. And so, then you get that filtered through the media, and you have the Exorcist movie and the book, which say that it's a demonic possession and all the rest of this stuff. Right. And then to the point where then the movie itself is considered cursed, and there's all these different things that happen with it where, people came to bad ends and people die and all the rest of it. And so, as this thing filters through culture, suddenly you have this, story which historically looks like it was a kid who was experiencing a kind of psychokinetic outburst that was causing some phenomena to happen around him, to becoming a cursed movie, and this movie that convinced people to come back to Catholicism and that.
And if you look at that case, not only was he kind of like the appropriate age, although it's mostly around girls, but boys can experience it too.
No, that's the other. So that's an interest. Just very quickly, that's another interesting thing. Christopher Lawson's research. So folks are interested in poltergeists and that kind of concept. Christopher Lawson has done extensive research on the historical development of our idea that poltergeists are preteen girls, experiencing this like hormonal change and that. And historically, it's actually not accurate. Poltergeist phenomena can happen at any time to any person that are under stressful experiences, kind of a stressful situation or an abusive situation.
Right. And that was going to be my other point, was that there's the possibility that he was sexually abused by his aunt.
Right.
So there was a lot going on there, and I mean, you can really look at exorcism in a sense, because like the normal, like people have it all wrong. I don't know if you watched William Friedkin's documentary that he did about exorcism, but a lot of what exorcism really is kind of more like this kind of it's a therapy, essentially. Right. It's not, pea soup and levitating, and even though that can happen, but like, if you actually see a real exorcism, it's essentially the person expressing themselves very violently and then calming down because they've been giving this religious kind of justification to be calm and to be somewhat at peace. And what it actually is, we don't really essentially know. but it's just like I think that there's probably a lot going on there in the person's psyche, and they need that calming and they need that religious ritual to make that happen.
Yeah, exactly.
I can definitely see that. Like you were referring to earlier, like the way Pasolka was analyzing how we're so mediated and that the media controls how people process these phenomenon. So I guess that's one of the 7 mountains for them to conquer.
Right.
Would be the media, because if they can get people to embrace the supernatural, and then they control the references and media that they process the supernatural through, that kind of solidifies them into that worldview.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, and one of the things I found interesting when I was researching the Satan's Target Your Mind piece was that I was subscribed to a bunch of Dominionist newsletters and that kind of thing. And one day I got an email from this one called the Elijah List, and they were recommending a CD that supposedly had a supernatural third tone that was added while this person was composing their music, right? And at the time, I do some like soundscape production and stuff on my own, and so I was looking at isochronic beats and binaural beats, also because I'm interested in the Monroe Institute and their work, and out of body experience. The Monroe Institute has developed Robert Monroe developed a sound structure to induce out of body experiences using binaural and isochronic tones. So what's interesting about the binaural beat is that it's a stereo function that basically the way that the waveforms go in the different stereo channels, it makes your brain create a third tone that actually isn't there. And so when I saw this, this third supernatural tone coming in, I was like, whoa, wait a second. Like you're putting a supernatural spin on binaural or isochronic tones. And so I listened to the thing, and sure enough, it was, a kind of like amateur synth piece that had isochronic or binaural beats in it, right? And so I was like, you guys that this stuff will cause hallucinations in susceptible people. So if you look at the science of hypnosis, there's a certain percentage of people that are easily hypnotically suggestible, right? And so if they hear this kind of stuff, they're going to start to have an induced experience, and then a certain percentage outside of that percentage will still have the experience but not be quite as suggestible. And so when you think about the entire kind of framework that's happening here, where someone's reading, a Tom Horn book about Nephilim stargates, and they're listening to this, third supernatural tone, and they're getting tripped out on, because they sold these things, they sold isochronic tone and binaural beat music as like audio drugs. Like it was actually marketed to some extent as you can get high off this music. Mm-hmm. And so
and you probably could.
Yeah, you actually can. Yeah, if you're within that percentage that's susceptible to this stuff, or if you allow yourself to be, you'll actually have kind of it'll definitely trigger some changes in the way that you're perceiving things. And so, if you think of the full environment, the media environment that's happening here, where somebody's going to church and they're hearing this, their pastor's telling them about this, and then they're going home and they're reading, whatever book that they're interested in that ties into this kind of concept, and then they're listening to this thing, and the instructions in the list, marketing for it were, it's God-given sound that you should listen to 24 hours a day, right? So I was like, wait, like you're literally, you're setting people up to just be completely tripped out on this music, reading this stuff about supernatural experiences and supernatural living and living in the spirit and all that. And when they listen to this, they're going to have an altered state of consciousness. It's the way that this stuff works. It's what it does, especially if you do it on headphones. And so they're literally creating this reality for people, and whether or not anything actually weird is happening, they're going to be tripped out on it, and they're going to be reading some pretty tripped out material, and then they go watch The Conjuring, like you're talking about, and it's starting to change their,
Wow.
And The Conjuring in and of itself has sound design, visual design, the frequency at which they do flicker rate and, on the screen, and the frequency at which images are flashed, subliminal stuff, right? So you've got subliminal music, subliminal visuals, subliminal writing. And that was one of the things I found with reading a lot of this material, was that it was written like mnemonic structures. So it was written as a memory structure,
I think we've touched on that before. How much? I think me and you have touched on it during the Conspirinormal chat we had about how a lot of this is related to neurolinguistic programming.
Right. So the very language of it, that's written in a way that it's easily digestible, and it's easily manipulating the way that you perceive things. So you've got like a perfect storm of making people, alter their worldview and alter the way they experience life.
Changing your whole frame.
Right. And so the interesting thing to me was that I didn't think that was a theory as I was looking at all these different components. And it wasn't until recently where I talked to somebody who was deployed in Afghanistan, and he was reading this stuff, and he was listening to the supernatural music, and he was, experiencing all that. And he was like, he read the Satan's Target Your Mind piece and said, yeah, that's exactly what happened to me. So here was an active military guy deployed in Afghanistan who was reading this material, who was listening to the music, who was in a war zone. So, the century
already heightened,
already way heightened in that. And, he was like, yeah, that's exactly what happened. That is exactly what happened to me. And so for me, having kind of speculated on it, having seen the component parts, when he told me that, I was like, oh man, like this is, and that's kind of where I went from like, the stuff's kind of interesting as a cultural artifact to being like, this is kind of dangerous. This is kind of not necessarily a positive thing for our culture.
But it sounds like an entire initiation system is what it all makes up.
Absolutely, yeah. You think of the Great Pyramids in that. There's a lot of material you can find on using the King's Chamber in the Great Pyramid. It's within the occult literature, as well as being actively deployed in the popular Christian culture. So,
well, it seems to me, and a lot of this is coming from the charismatic side. In fact, just about all of it really is. And it seems to me that a lot of the charismatic stuff, like somebody has read something, has gotten an idea, or they're in some kind of, like, if you think about like where charismatic Christianity started, it was Azusa Street in the 1920s, right? I think that's correct.
Well,
if you look at if you kind of like look at what's going on in 1920s in LA, you got a lot of stuff happening. I mean, you got Theosophy, Manly P. Hall, you got all this kind of interesting, all these ideas are just in this milieu, and then all of a sudden they just pick up on these things. And I've noticed this about charismatic Christianity, that there's a lot of things that you'll see, and in fact, that's been a critique from some of the more kind of stolid, more mainstream Christian people, that they have picked up on, like, these concepts, like for instance, like the laughing churches, which is essentially Kundalini.
Right.
Todd Bentley is one of those guys that is huge on that.
Yeah, but you gotta talk about Todd Bentley's other thing, which is kicking people in the face.
That too. So it just and there's even stuff that's just like, straight up just necromancy, like the idea of raising people from the dead.
Well, the grave sucking too. I mean, the grave sucking thing was something that that made me make like Photoshop collages. The concept of grave sucking. Have you read about that?
I have not. What is grave sucking?
Oh man, grave sucking is amazing. So the grave sucking was the Vineyard movement. One of their offshoot groups decided that and Benny Hinn actually did this as well, but no, I don't.
Okay.
He didn't term it grave sucking, but he did do the practice. But I believe it was the Vineyard movement, which is a Canadian, the Toronto Blessing, which is supposedly like the second or third Azusa Street kind of revival, like outpouring of the Spirit sort of thing. But they go to graves of famous charismatic evangelists, and they absorb the mantle, and they absorb the kind of like charismata that's on the grave. And I think it's in Ezekiel. There's something about touching the bones of the forefathers in one of the prophetic books that they draw on as their inspiration. But they actually go and lay on a grave and like inhale the inspiration that this former evangelist had, and it got the popular term of grave sucking or grave soaking, and there's photos of pastors' wives and youth groups and stuff like going to like Catherine Kuhlman's grave, and Catherine Kuhlman's a famous revivalist preacher from LA, I believe. They would go to these graves and they would lay on the thing and absorb the mantle. So that was that to me. I mean, just that, like you said, the necromantic element of that was just too much. I couldn't quite handle it.
There's a certain amount of like ancestor worship in there too.
Yeah,
that's that whole idea.
Well, and it's for me like too, it's interesting because it does tie into this kind of the idea of the communion of saints. There is a historical precedence for believing that all the saints are still alive and that they do exist in kind of a space of living, that they don't ever die, and so they are there to be accessed. And that gets into denominational questions of what that means. There's some kind of haphazard adoption of these ideas that gets kind of funky.
Can you define the third wave charismatic? I'm not familiar with that term.
It's a term for you had the Azusa Street revival, right? And there were actually I don't know. There's a couple different ones that could be the like first and second. So you had the there were revivals that happened in the 1800s, which is why I kind of got hesitant on the idea that Pentecostalism, going to Azusa Street was really the first of the charismatic, because there were what was called enthusiasm and perfectionism in the 1800s, which was actually stemming out of the burned over district in New York, which is where you get the spiritualism as well. And that kind of coincided also with the Ghost Dance movement, which was an apocalyptic kind of charismatic movement in the First Nations groups. And then, so that was in the 1800s. Then you get the Azusa revival in the early 1900s. Then you get the 1946. You get what was known as the Healing Revival, where it was a lot of tent preachers. That's where Oral Roberts comes out of. Who are the Lester Summerall, and a lot of this. So in the Azusa Street, there wasn't a lot of exorcism focus. In the Healing Revival, it was heavily exorcist focused. A. Allen was a popular preacher at the time. They had these tent revivals. They had television shows. That's where kind of Oral Roberts comes out of that tradition. Benny Hinn kind of comes out of the Healing Revival tradition as well. And then the third wave is the Toronto Blessing and the Laughing, charismatic experience in that. And that comes
kicking people in the face.
Kicking people in the face to knock the thing. And so the kicking people in the face actually comes from this guy Smith Wigglesworth, who was part of around the Azusa Street time. He was a UK preacher who used to punch people. He was known to, when they died, he would demand, that death has no victory, and he would punch them. And according to the anecdotes,
dead people in the coffin or something.
Yeah, well, it'd be like he'd come to their deathbed, right? Like, because it was, this is before funerary practice was as kind of sterile as it is now. So you would go to the wake and like just punch somebody, and like they would come, they would, according to the anecdotes, come back to life. Now though, with the
Wake up.
and I know I'm all over the place here, but this stuff is just so like, I mean, most people don't actually like get to experience these concepts or whatever, but there's actually a dead raising movement, which I think is what you were talking about,
Right. Yeah.
which it's actually like a niche kind of genre within the charismatic movement, and it's focused on raising the dead. And there was I don't know if it was a TV show, they did do a documentary called like The Dead Raisers, and it was, it's these people that I'm actually subscribed on Facebook to a group where it's, folks who practice this dead raising thing, and they'll post a picture of someone who's dead or a picture of them in the hospital prior to them having died, and then they'll ask for them to be in the name of Jesus to raise up and be alive. And it's weird to me because it's sad in some ways, because you see like, they'll grab people like from news articles that have died or whatever, and they'll be praying for this person's physical resurrection. And it's
that sounds a little like the Mormon genealogy stuff.
I've seen Benny Hinn do that too. I've seen him instruct that he sees somewhere out there on the other side of the television, someone is there with their relative in a coffin, and bring the coffin in front of the TV screen, and they're being raised.
Right.
Oh my gosh.
Right.
Yeah, that was probably like over 20 years ago, but I remember that. You could probably find it still on YouTube or something.
Wow.
This is crazy stuff, man. And we're not, I don't want people to think we're like on some big witch hunt, looking for heterodoxies. But when there's, political ambitions and things that aren't so great for everyone, it's good to take a look at what's behind all this,
Yeah, and that's I didn't have any, because, studying parapsychology, a lot of the things that these people talk about as being true, I don't know about the dead raising thing, but even within that, there may be some truth to some of the claims,
Yeah. These are practices that have obviously, survived since antiquity.
Right. With faith healing and that, I've met faith healers outside of the Christian tradition within the, kind of Southern folk magic tradition, and, or crossing over. Most of the people that I've met who practice what people would call hoodoo and that, which isn't a term that anybody uses down here, but they've been within a Christian church. And that was one of the things I found kind of funny, was that it was only because I was comfortable with charismatic congregations and comfortable with Christianity that I actually had any access whatsoever to people who practice these things that most people would think of were occult or witchcraft or magic and that. And it was because, I was open to the Christian aspect, and then they allowed me to hear about the other kind of practices that they did, which were still within what they understood as Christianity. It just wasn't what, orthodox, strict doctrinal denominations would consider that,
What are some of your techniques for getting people to open up about this stuff? I guess you kind of hinted at it, letting them know you're familiar with their religious background. But other than that, do you have or are you just one of those people that people open up to?
I listen and I don't judge.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And right. I'm more concerned with people than I am with ideas. So I'm not out there like hunting for stuff. I'm not eager to hear their secrets or anything. So I'm open to hear about people's lives and about, because a lot of the stories that I've heard about people's relatives that have practiced something or that it's been in the context of sharing their memories of somebody that they loved, and sharing that kind of connection that they have to their past. And I personally have that kind of connection to my family and to my grandparents and my great-grandparents and that. And so being able to have a memory of my own history helps me to connect with folks in that way. And then, one instance where I was working at a charismatic food ministry through my brother when I first moved down here, and it was in the context of working there that I got to experience the pleading of the blood, which is an interesting charismatic practice of literally calling down the blood of Christ on everything and kind of visualizing that happening, like the crucifixion and the blood pouring off of the crucifixion onto your physical space and your body and all that. And the person who did that later, one of our coworkers got a call where her daughter had gotten a severe burn while she was at home, and when that was mentioned, he asked her if she wanted him to go and talk out the fire. And so knowing what that meant, which is it's a Southern practice of there's certain passages in the Bible that you can read over a burn that will supposedly heal it. In the fact that I knew what that practice was, I already worked with them, and all that. So I was able to talk to him about it in a way, and also to not. I wasn't like, I don't know how to put it. Like, he knew that I wasn't overly credulous, so I wasn't like, ooh, what is that? And I also wasn't like dismissive. So I was in a neutral space where I was like, that's interesting. Like, what are you doing here? So I guess just honesty about where I'm coming from,
One thing that I wanted to ask you, David, and we've noticed this from talking to guys like Jack Montgomery and Tony Cale and even Timothy Renner, especially about like the powwow tradition. Because we've kind of talked about some of the newer kind of charismatic stuff that is kind of drawn on like kind of these newer, like older occult beliefs, and they're probably really borrowed sometime in the 20th century. But then you're also dealing with something you just talked about, which is an older folk tradition,
right?
And something that is essentially, for the last 2,000 years that Christianity has been around, has essentially been concurrent with Christianity,
right?
Has been parallel to it. And I've noticed really like the study of folk religion, which I've become more and more fascinated with, is how it really has this Christian veneer and has for centuries.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's it. Really, only in the probably in the 1800s, maybe in the 1700s, where it drifted off from that, and that was mainly a kind of an elite, purposeful distancing from Christianity. So there was kind of like a Druid revival that happened in the 1700s and the 1800s, pulling away from that. But even within that, like you have Blake talking about Druidism, and he's still tying it into Christianity. And yeah, a lot of the stuff that people would think of as witchcraft and that, like if you look at the old Incan, there's a book called the Carmina Gallica, which is like the song of the Gaelic people, and it was collected by I think his name was Alexander Carmichael, but it was all these incantations and spells and that, and they're all Christian for the most part. And when they're not Christian, they're influenced through Christianity, right? Like it may have some Celtic deities mentioned, like Brigid and that, but they're through a kind of Christian veneer, and it's interesting because this kind of like anti-Christian idea comes from the evangelicalism and the weaponized Christianity that has turned against these things, like one of the jokes in like a rural area is you've got Baptists and you got country people, right? And so like country people make moonshine, and sometimes the Baptists do too, but they don't talk about it. But the country folks, they don't care. they're living their lives. They just want to survive. They do what works. They've got a story or a tradition that was passed down through their family, and they continue it. They go to church because that's where everybody goes. They, worship God because God is good, right? Like and it's not to simplify it or to make it look like it's, just this simple weird thing, but there's a difference between the Baptists who connect to this kind of world system and the country folks who just try to do what they need to do to get by for the next day, and make their family safe and keep their family safe. And a lot of these folk traditions carry through, the country folks. And that, that means that it exists in the church. It means it exists in their church. And these churches, they're not connected to any. It's really strange because I can picture living in the suburbs of Chicago and the way that I viewed the world and how the world works. And then living down here in rural Georgia, which is only, its own kind of microcosm of that. But I think that anyone living in a suburban or an urban area, maybe more so in the urban area, they might understand it, but the rules don't apply. Like these structures and these systems that everybody thinks exist that kind of shape things, they don't exist. And when you're out in the country, like they definitely don't exist, and so these kind of denominational ideas or these ideas of what Christianity is or isn't, the Bible is a place to record your family, right? Like I've got a Bible from my mom that has my like family line in it, my whole family tree written in it. And she had a Bible that was from the 1800s that had a family line written in it. And your understanding of the Bible is not shaped by other books or media. It's shaped by what you're told and what you live and how you experience that. And it's a totally different way of experiencing Christianity and this concept. And I would say it would be the same thing if you go to, I've done some research on rural Sufism, which is kind of ecstatic, charismatic practice of Islam versus state-sponsored Sufism. And the rural what was interesting to me about the rural versions of Sufi practice was that they were very similar, if not exact, to the practices of the snake handlers in the South, including self-harm and the rest of it, ecstatic dances and that kind of thing. And I think you could even find it in like, Haitian Vodun, where you're going to find a difference between a kind of an elite practice of it and a kind of systematic, almost state-sponsored practice of it versus what you're going to find in a mountain somewhere in Haiti, and so these folk traditions and these folk practices, they come out of living life. They come out of what works, the dowser that I heard about from the area that I'm living in now, who was 108 years old when he died, he lived through the Spanish flu, and he was known as a local healer. He was known to heal it's called thrash. It's a fungal infection that happens in babies. And now people would go to the hospital and get it healed, but back then they had these folks who could supposedly heal it through different, practices, and he was able to do that. And then him being able to do that, oftentimes that appeared as a child or as a teenager, and that would be what led you then into being known as a healer for other things, whether it was talking out the fire or stopping blood flow. And so, he could do these practices, and then he could also douse, which was, the ability to find water, which nowadays you go out with some seismic equipment, or you look at a map of the area and you figure out the way the land is laying and where the different, aquifers are and that kind of thing. You can figure out where the water is. Back then, it was, if you're gonna drill down 100 feet, you're gonna want to know that you're drilling 100 feet in somewhere good, or if, even worse, if you're gonna dig by hand, right, like 100 feet down, you're gonna want to know where that is. So these things have to work.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, something that gets missed now when we can just go to some other method that works better or seems to work better. It's missing the fact that, back when these things were truly practiced and practiced regularly, they had to work. Like, it's not like, like, oh, we'll get the dowser out here and it's kind of witchy and fun and like it's going to happen. Like, no, if your dowser didn't find you where the water was, you just spent like how long digging 100 feet down by hand. That's a miserable, especially in Georgia. Like, you're digging out, like, when did you do that? During the like freezing damp horrible winter, or during the awfully hot sweaty summer? Either way, digging 100 feet down in the ground is going to be a miserable experience.
It's practical.
Yeah.
Well, it's just real important, I think, to document what's left of these local flavors. As the suburbs encroach more into one giant shopping center and mega churches, you still have a lot of this stuff left, and hopefully it can be preserved and a lot of these traditions do continue on.
Yeah, it's interesting because where I'm at, like, there's a lot of abandoned houses. There's a lot of memories, that was my grandfather's house, or that was, Mr. So-and-so's house. That was the general store. And it's, slowly being encroached. Where I was previously living when we talked last, there was a lot more of that because Athens and UGA was pushing out into that area. Where I'm at now, there's not quite as much of that. But yeah, it's, but these things always change.
Right.
People will always be lacking resources and having to do things to get the resources,
Very interesting stuff. I kind of wanted to get to a little bit of your thoughts about the relation between folk magic and psi.
Yeah. That's been amazing to me since Chicago. The DeLawrence books that I mentioned, the William Walker Atkinson books. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I noticed was that the instructions that they gave for clairvoyance were the same thing you were going to find at the Stanford Research Institute remote viewing research, right? Like the protocols that were given were very similar. So instead of, you could pick up a book from the early 1900s and get the kind of, top level, like, government science research onto clairvoyance that, from this 1900s book, and then moving down here and really living in it, where, I had this one experience where I went to a folk arts festival at an antique shop that I'm fond of that was down the road from where I was living. And every single person there had what would be described as a psi experience that they would talk about openly, whether it was experiencing their husband after they passed, or an out-of-body experience, or a premonition, precognition or something. And they were all very open about it, but they didn't use the parapsychological terms, And it really showed me how these things are a kind of living fact of being human and just being who we are. And, parapsychology is the science of studying that. But it was amazing to see it just kind of like alive. And then you think about these, the kind of folk magic traditions which sort of codify that in the same way that parapsychology seeks to codify it through science. And I think that it's very, psi kind of drives that. And one of the things that was really interesting to me is that there's a fellow from up north of me called Ed Edwards, that's his name, who he's from the same county that Deliverance was filmed in, right? So you think of the movie Deliverance, and you think about that kind of picture of the South, which, however accurate that would be,
not very flattering.
That. Although I got to tell you, the kid who plays banjo in Deliverance, like, still performs at festivals down here.
Oh yeah.
He. So that's still he's a proud local representative. But he comes from that county. He worked with folks that were basically from rural North Georgia. He ended up working with people at the University of Chicago who had worked with Fermi and some of the guys who worked on the Manhattan Project. Okay. He was studied for years in the parapsychology labs for his ability to foster psychokinetic activity. He's currently being studied by the University of Virginia. The only reason that he has the abilities that he has is because his mom was a faith healer. And his mom, he got sick when he was a kid. His mom practiced faith healing on him, which seems to, the tradition that she was taught in seems to have something to do with accessing some kind of psychokinetic ability. She basically flooded his system when he was still in development with this. And he was around it all the time and always practicing the kind of techniques that he was taught to foster this ability. And now he's working with labs across the United States to demonstrate the ability, And so it's, to me, that was Ed's kind of like the perfect example of how, these folk traditions and, what they were doing in the Stargate program and the rest of it are just so closely and intimately tied. And how, these two kind of spheres of like high science and like low magic are, they're on the same spectrum, and they both need each other.
Cool. We had a real cool discussion here, kind of all over the place. But just hope instead of listening to those, what was the name of that? The supernatural sounds. What was that stuff called?
No, you guys got to insert some isochronic tones underneath this.
Isochronic, yeah.
Yeah, get the audience primed.
I'll just listen to Tangerine Dream, man.
Put on some
isochronic tones. Yeah. Well, David, thank you so much for doing this. It's been a really great pleasure having you on. Tell people where they can find you, find some of your work, and if they want, if they're interested in contacting you or just all that good stuff.
davidmetcalfe.wordpress.com is probably the best place to read all my ramblings. David B. Metcalfe on Twitter, which I occasionally post to, and happy to field any questions or anything. Okay. And also on academia.edu, just if people are on that, is where my more serious stuff is.
Okay, well, excellent. It's been great to have you. Stay on the line for us. We're going to close out this section, and guys, we will be back on Conspirinormal. Welcome back to Conspirinormal, guys. That was a great conversation with David Metcalfe. Always enjoy having David on. I think I could probably talk to that guy for hours, and we did talk to him for hours. Because after that conversation, we talked for another about 20-30 minutes on a Patreon episode, which you guys will hear pretty soon, and also we talked for another like 20 minutes about some other things. So we just enjoy talking to David tonight. And also want to remind everybody, David will be part of our Strange Realities conference, which was going to be online this year. So by the time that you guys hear this, everything should be up. We're going to probably have some special pricing, but for most people, it's probably going to be about $20 is going to be the price for this thing. And we got some really good people, so stay tuned for more information on that. So
if you don't know, now you know.
And guys, too, we mentioned Patreon before, and Sergio can tell you how to access that.
You can go to patreon.com/Conspirinormal to become a part of our secret society. And with each step in a higher pledge per month, you will be awarded ancient wisdom, lesson plans, and secret degrees. Yes. Again, that's at patreon.com/Conspirinormal, or for one-time payments. If you don't want anything recurring, you can just go to Conspirinormal.com, and please leave those iTunes reviews.
Please, guys, leave those. And if you've left them since we recorded this on June the 16th, then thank you. And also, don't forget the YouTube channel. Give us a subscribe on there. That's at Conspirinormal Podcast. All right, guys, that's pretty much it. Join us next week. We're going to have more Conspirinormal weirdness on this show, Conspirinormal.
If you would like to help the show, please consider becoming a Patreon at www.patreon.com/Conspirinormal, or leave a one-time donation at Conspirinormal.com. And please check out our YouTube channel, Conspirinormal Podcast.